Welcome to Learned or Be Learned. We all have a story, we're all the hero of our own story, and whether your story is worth reading when it ends is up to you. I'm your host, Shiva Dhanasekar, and let's get into episode 3. So I saw a couple of your podcasts. I think the one that you just did was really cool. I think you should maybe explain a little bit how the experience was and who you actually got to meet.
Oh yeah, well that's still really fresh in my mind since it was only a couple of days ago. But it was great to be on the Joe Rogan show and have the Joe Rogan Experience. It was a fantastic opportunity. I don't know what else I can say. It was great to meet him, and the point of it all, I guess, was just to have a conversation with him, and that felt like we got into it and went in all kinds of different directions, and that was
Of course.
super enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. You ever ask him about what the Buddha statue's all about in the corner?
There were a lot of little knickknacks and all kinds of things in there that, again, looking back, there's so much I think I could have or should have done. But there were a number of things I was curious about in that room that I didn't ask
Okay. Well, yeah, you. It was really cool. I actually watched the whole thing. It was very interesting, and I actually wanted to mention something you mentioned in the podcast at the very beginning. You talked about how your interest is not in the conventional containers of religion, but more so the cultural intersects of what you consider religion to be. And I thought that was really interesting. I was wondering if you could kind of explain a little bit about what are the other aspects of religion you consider.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why I find the study of religion so exciting, is because it's so much more than just, again, the containers might not be a fair way to describe the world's religions, but you know what I'm saying, that there's more to being religious than, whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim and so on. So that's what I'm trying to get to and explore is how people are religious in other ways and in other kind of in other terms.
Right.
But again, because that's what people keep asking about is sort of, well, what's your definition of religion? And not, it's, I don't want to get all nerdy, but it's a non-substantive definition. I don't care about what people think in terms of their experience and what it all means, and some kind of, kind of pure essence to it all, whether it's God, the spirit, whatever. I'm much more interested in sort of, well, again, it's sort of simplistic, but how religions function
Hmm.
and how religious ideas and activities are expressed. Uh,
Hmm.
whether we're talking about what someone's doing in a church, what someone might be doing at a sports event.
Would you consider healthcare to be a form of this embodiment of religion with your working definition?
You know, yeah, health is a very kind of critical aspect of religious life.
Hmm.
And I think, yeah, absolutely. And that when you study religion means, at least for me, that, that entails, what is health? There's
Yeah.
another term that's difficult to really define and can be defined in different ways in
Hmm.
different cultures. I think certainly the concern about some kind of really ultimate organic combination of physical, mental, emotional, I would say something spiritual, is all kind of caught up in notions of health.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting, especially considering in Western healthcare and medicine, we see the glorification of the white coat, right? I'd say that's has some embodiment of what we see in some religious aspects as well.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I hate to say it, but I've written about that. I've tried to write about what described, and the title of this article is called "The Cult of Doctors."
Hmm.
And so I do want to look at the white coat and all it symbolizes, and but particularly in what I'm look at in that article is really the rise of biomedicine as the primary cultural authority in
Hmm.
modern society in the early 20th century. So the doctor and the figure of the doctor, especially, from whatever 1900s through to the 1960s, is, I think, a really symbolically charged and has traces of religious meanings and connections in some way.
Okay, yeah. So you say like symbolically charged. Would you say that the reason we would glorify the aspect of doctors would be because essentially they're kind of like healers, they're the opposite of death? Because you talk a lot about death, right? So is that kind of like the other side of the coin on that, or?
Well, again, especially when we're talking about a particular kind of doctor, like the
Mm,
medical doctor that we
yeah.
all know, and often, put our trust in, our most sacred trust in,
Hmm.
because of, as you say, what we assume are to be their healing powers,
Yes.
and things that and something that matters ultimately,
Hmm.
for us, and that's the state of our body, and how are we doing, and so doctors take care of that. But absolutely, especially in the again early 20th century, when medical doctors really begin to become seen as I said, sort of cultural authorities, but also, embodiments of the promise of science, not just healers, but people who can perform miracles. And
Hmm.
you just can find all of this language and imagery around the doctor in the white coat. Obviously, at this time too, especially usually a white male, in all kinds of interesting cultural data from again this 1900 early 1900s through to the 1960s, when a lot of that begins to change.
Yeah, I think that the idea that the healer and as a doctor is kind of interesting, but do you think this essence of spirituality is kind of eroding, or I don't know, it's being like kind of how separation of church and state, the idea of healing is that separating from religion as we move on, especially in the Western world?
Yeah, well, speaking in generalities, I would say separation definitely occurred over the course of the 20th century,
Hmm.
as science became a primary paradigm in our lives in so many ways. And again, the perception at the time was science was replacing religion, or
Yeah.
really being the primary arbiter of certain kinds of truth. So that's questionable, and there are all kinds of interesting intersections between religion and science. But again, that was the general perception. But I think that's completely changed. So now we're seeing many more initiatives and all kinds of evidence, to a degree, I suppose, of an attempt to return and bring those two back together, sort of
Hmm.
spirituality and healing in some form or other.
Yeah, no, for sure. You mentioned your white coat article. I actually had a different article from, I think was it Huffington Post, right? You have a few articles
I
there.
think there are some from a little while
Yeah,
back.
I found
Yeah.
one that the title was "Learning to Die." I found
Yes.
I actually pulled up a quote. I kind of want to read it. You said, "Let's not forget that death is indeed the great equalizer, no matter who you are or your status in life. Forget the art of the deal when death comes for you. No negotiation, no threats, no manipulations. It's the price we pay for life." And especially that last sentence caught me very much so.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, I don't know. What can I say? I mean, this is difficult lesson or perspective to acquire and to achieve, and
Hmm.
in some ways, and in other ways, there are many people who are, very reflective on death and understand that this is an inevitability that somehow we all have to struggle with and figure out.
I think what really caught me was like how you said this is the price we pay for life, right? So essentially, when you think of like immortality, that the idea seems cool in the moment, but when you really think about it, life like continuously would mean nothing without the other side being death giving it its meaning. And I think that's what's so powerful about what you study in death.
Well, yeah, thanks again. I mean, I think you're right on, and how you're taking that. But it's certainly something that many others have said in some ways. That it's just life requires death,
Hmm.
and so the two are intimately connected, in cellular level, all the way to the much broader macroscopic level in some ways. This is how it is. So how do we integrate that into our lives? And that's, I guess, part of what I've kind of been doing.
Now, obviously, within death, there's a lot of different types of areas you could go. Right, you could sacrifices, homicides. Um, I guess the segue into this, I was wondering what if you considered religion to be a cult or a form of such. But
Oh yeah, like a death cult.
mm,
Yeah, definitely. Religion is all about death. I mean, this is what gives life to religion too. What does it mean to die? Is there an afterlife? How do we live with the dead? This is the you could just go through and sort of easily pick out different ways in which religions are clearly, by necessity, focused on death.
Hmm. And I guess the reason I segued into that was I wanted to especially talk about the Jonestown massacre, about how they willingly or and some not so willingly or over like 900 people died. I just think that's very interesting how you can persuade some to sacrifice themselves, and obviously this isn't the first time. It goes back to way before even the major religions. I was just wondering like what can
Sure. Well, I
motivate.
mean, that kind of, I don't know if you call it mass sacrifice, or, we have to be careful in terms of the details of that. And
Mhm.
there are certainly all kinds of kind of historical and cultural specificities in that case that are, both unique to the time, but also, as you're saying, you can find other kinds of examples,
Mhm.
of people who seem to be willingly going to their death, whether it's to follow a particular leader in some way, or you could look at war as another example.
Mhm.
People who were fired up and inspired to go to battle where death is obviously a possibility and a different kind of reality. So that seems pretty, again, pretty unique, but also there are interesting ways it connects with other kinds of phenomena.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, the other day I was taking a walk through. I'm in Dallas. I was taking a walk through downtown Dallas, and right next to the mall, this really nice, beautiful mall, there was this graveyard. And
Hmm.
I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I always find graveyards a little eerie. I know that's also a personal opinion because it can also be very comforting for those who have lost in that particular graveyard. But isn't it I don't know what this dichotomy of also like you see in movies that graveyards are sometimes depicted as more like in horror movies or something, right? So I'm just curious, like that dichotomy exists so easily, but
Yeah.
it's also so sometimes ignored. I don't know. That's kind of.
Right. Yeah, and there too, it's very much tied to certain kinds of cultural and historical circumstances where we think in terms of the sort of dichotomy issue.
Hmm.
But obviously, a universal question that all human cultures and individuals must face is, what do we do with the corpse?
Hmm.
And that gets answered in a lot of different ways.
Hmm.
The cemetery, as we see it today, has again this sort of specific history in Western culture, especially, and then in American history as well, where the cemetery is first really primarily associated with the church or some kind of religious institution,
Hmm.
but very soon breaks apart and becomes a separate entity.
Hmm.
That again, there too is a question of where do we put the cemetery. When it was first associated with the church, it was often in the very center of town, in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Yeah.
But as you have more urban populations, um, growing urban populations, you see a concern around public health and making sure actually you don't want to have the dead in with the living. You want to put them out in the margins, of these urban areas, and
Hmm.
somehow not far away, but not so far away that, as you were saying, you can't go and visit your loved ones.
Hmm.
So the placement of where cemeteries are, and then how, just in terms of living patterns, and how the sprawl of suburbs and
Hmm.
people moving out to what were once the margins. You see this interesting mix of where
Hmm.
different cemeteries might show up along the social landscape.
I saw this cool thing where you would actually cremate the body and put it in soil and then plant a tree. So it's almost like a spiritual instead of a grave site. It's like you go visit the tree every year or kind of show your condolences and your mourning through that, which I thought was a very like, beautiful way to kind of show the cycle of life.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Very unique for sure.
Well, it's fascinating just how the ways in which we now dispose of the dead is really all over the place, and
Hmm.
a variety of ways in which people choose to take care of their dead is just kind of a consumer landscape that we haven't really ever seen before. And what's, I find particularly interesting, even though, everything has changed since the pandemic and thinking about the dead and our relationships with the dead. But before the pandemic, you really kind of, I mean, I observed a diminishing interest in the body as a central presence in sort of main funerary rites and
Mm.
ceremonies, in taking care of and disposing of the dead. That's, I think, a pretty significant shift that is worth studying and thinking about. Is why is the body less and less important when we help, in this final passage of life to death, and making sure we take care of the body in ways that are socially appropriate, but also appropriate for the individual who's died.
Do you think movies and video games kind of have also desensitized this sense of importance in mourning, or I guess an individual's death that isn't really exactly related to you?
Well, I don't know if it's desensitized. You mean in terms of you?
Just death in general. Like I feel like when we think about a death, especially like someone like a celebrity, let's say like Kobe Bryant, that death was huge. It took a huge impact on people. But then you think of someone who no one really is not very famous, or you see someone in a movie die, kind of just don't have that same sympathy. And also in movies, it's not real, but also this feeling of, I don't know, we're emotional creatures, and it just doesn't seem to provoke as big of an emotion as maybe some other events in a movie.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I see. I can see what you're saying. I think that's right. I don't know if you're in the death and dying class next semester, but we're going to cover a lot of that. A lot of that
I
stuff.
actually took one a couple years back. Already took a death and dying course, but it was super cool.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. I remember.
Yeah, it was very interesting class, kind of tying in other religious aspects of where they see how to mourn and stuff. Uh,
Right.
I
Well, to get to your question, though, I mean, I think, on the one hand, popular culture, you could say, desensitizes us. It's a false reality or something. It's just entertainment. But on the other hand, I find it to be very powerful
mhm,
in how it shapes our attitudes, as you were saying about, death, how we think about death, how we might experience death, how we think we're supposed to experience death.
mhm,
So I find it very compelling and influential in
mhm,
American society today. Um, the question of celebrities is one that's fascinating, and certainly the death of celebrities brings out all kinds of what I would call religious ritual, religious activity that isn't tied to any necessarily religious tradition or church, but has to do more with, again, this sort of those intersections of religion, spirituality, and cultural life. And so, yeah, we feel a certain kind of intimacy and have certain kinds of investments in celebrities
mhm.
that we could go on and on about. But that kind of special bond, even though it may be artificial, since most of us didn't know Kobe Bryant or whatever,
Mhm.
still runs deep
Yeah,
when someone, especially, dies, young.
yeah,
It's a different reaction than when someone who's in their um, 80s or 90s
mhm,
dies and has had a full life.
mhm.
And again, who's been in the public eye too.
Especially when a lot of people relate to someone as a father figure, as a you know ex-athlete, all sorts of ways to connect with someone who's not very old is kind of shocking to see someone have their life together and just abruptly taken away. Is I guess that's
Yeah,
what shook the American culture.
yeah, no, absolutely. And for many people, it'll be a marker. It's going to be impressed on memory, so that it'll be, well, I remember where I was when that
Mhm,
happened, and it'll be. I mean, that's increasingly how we live our lives is in relation to these markers of death.
yeah.
I got to write that down. That no, you know what I'm saying. That's, and then how do we navigate ourselves, our way through that?
Mhm.
Whether it's our grandfather or grandmother or our pet or some kind of celebrity that we are particularly fond of, or
Mhm. No, yeah, I agree that markers of death thing is crucial. Right? There's the genocide of Hitler. There was 9/11. These things are huge events in our history that can never be forgotten. Pearl Harbor. They're just like stuck in history, and they're definitely markers for sure.
Well, right. No, and that's great. And that's at the more collective level.
Mm.
On the personal level, existential level,
Uh-huh.
it is
Yes.
how we individually are thinking through these things,
Hmm.
and living with the presence of death. But as you're saying too, as a society, certainly these maybe the most important collective markers of memory, and especially and not just memory, but our sense of identity as a society, is how we respond to those big, massive kind of mass death events.
Yeah. I actually, I have your book right here, the one you recently wrote, the Don't
What
Think.
else you got? You got a bunch of stuff up there.
Yeah, it was. I actually read it. It was the entire thing. It was really cool. I think my favorite chapter.
You read it?
I did read it. I did read it.
Wow.
My favorite chapter was definitely the one on Walt Disney, just because just because I think him. It's very interesting as someone who's very inspirational to children to kind of illustrate death at such an early age. Yeah, I think didn't his mother pass away at like an early age or something? So most of his movies don't have a mother figure in them or a mother who dies or something. I think that's like really interesting how because when we think of Disney movies, they're so glorified as like this like happy ending, perfect movies. Yet there is also death in them, which is
Right.
very cool.
Or the fear of death, or death, in some more symbolic sense. So it's what I've tried to show there is that it's pretty pervasive in those films, and
Hmm.
that was one. I mean, that was just a fun article to write, and it was just very fulfilling. I don't know, if I should say that, but in any case, I really dug digging into it,
Hmm.
and basically tried, I think, to both look at death in the life of Disney and look at these themes of death, in the films themselves, and then also how people responded to them. And, it was pretty overwhelming. And again, the point was to not contest, but to sort of throw out for consideration the notion that maybe America isn't as much of a culture that denies death as people say it is. It's a little more complex than just America is a death denying culture.
Hmm. Do you, speaking of death and Walt Disney, do you, have you heard those conspiracy theories that he's like cryoed somewhere in Disneyland or something?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, this this is a mythology. This is American, mythology around
Yeah.
what I would call a kind of an icon. Someone who is more than an icon. Another colleague of mine written about cultural saints. These are
Hmm.
people who have sacred status in
Hmm.
our lives in a big way. Not just they're a celebrity, but this is someone who really has shaped American culture in ways maybe more profound than just about anyone else in the 20th century. And there is I'm not recalling the names of the authors, but there's as I remember it, a book called The American Monomyth that
Hmm.
tries to look at some of these cultural saints and religious aspects of culture, and the argument or is made that the two most important figures in the 20th century in terms of sort of cultural life, and particularly these ties with kind of religious cultures, are Walt Disney and Hugh Hefner. So, sex and childhood. I don't know. It's not something. Those are, when you think about it,
Yeah.
youth or something. Driving forces in American life.
Yeah. No, I came across I don't know that the theory of him being cryoed a while back, and I thought that was just absolutely. I mean, it's. I'm not gonna discredit it. I'm not gonna say I'm not gonna
Well,
say it happens or didn't happen. I just think that's a very interesting conspiracy theory, just like many others out there.
well, that's worth then researching if you want to try to figure out. But for me, this it's part of that mythology, and especially around, is he really dead?
Yeah.
So back to that question in terms of his ending.
Hmm. Yeah. Actually, there was. there was like, I think part of it was they're talking about how the new Frozen movie came out, and they're saying, did you read about that? They
No, no, but I can't wait. Yeah.
they said there was like, oh, they named it Frozen because now when you look up Disney Frozen, you're not going to find a ton of articles about him being cryoed. It's
Right, right.
like buried deep in
Yeah.
the net, which I thought was just, I don't know. That's really interesting. But I mean, there's
Well, again, nothing surprises me. Who knows?
Mhm,
In terms of how they were thinking about that movie and what to title it.
mhm.
I haven't seen it, so
No, neither have I.
I know. Okay, well,
I guess to get into a little bit about the class we're currently in, almost finished with drugs and religion, right? I think particularly psychedelics and hallucinogens is very interesting because I mean pharmaceuticals, caffeine, these like other kind of drugs exist, but I think the one that's really intriguing is the one that had a lot of backlash from the government, a lot of high like they like hid a lot of information, and but people are saying it unlocked their creativity, and a lot of very successful people used it, like Steve Jobs, Jimi Hendrix. I
you're
thought
talking
that.
about LSD.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, LSD in particular. But yeah, what do you think? Do you think that can help someone? I mean, not endorsing it, but in saying for the
Yeah.
people that did take it, do you think it really helped with their creativity? Or
Well, I take them for their word, at least, and the fact that a number of people, their lives intersect in some way with psychedelics
Mhm,
doesn't surprise me, and how people understand the impact of that experience in their lives in the longer run.
mhm,
There too, it wouldn't surprise me that for many people, psychedelics, LSD has brought some kind of degree of enhancement or some new perspective on the self and reality and so on. But you also see it for sure in different artists and innovators.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I guess inspiration's a weird thing. It comes to you at, which is actually what my the book I read on the podcast before this was all about, was how like boredom unlocks your creativity, and how inspiration can come to you at like sometimes your most boring or most relaxed states. So I mean, it's just interesting how the mind works and how to
Right.
really unlock your personal creativity, which comes in many different forms, I'd say.
Absolutely, not just through psychedelics or drug induced.
Yeah.
Right. People find all kinds of ways to get the creative juices flowing.
Hmm.
And that can come from a variety of different sources, and
Hmm.
certainly from dreams, or from just trying to discipline yourself, or exercise, or even just sitting and being still.
Yeah. No.
So yeah, I mean that's. But we're in the class going to be really looking at the Beatles and Chance the Rapper, and trying to read a little bit more about and think a little bit more about music and psychedelics, and here too some of the religious sensibilities that are associated with that in musical expression, um, in terms of artist experience,
Hmm.
as well as in terms of the audience, and we'll read a bit about raves and think about um, concerts and music festivals
Hmm.
as well.
Exactly about music is so enticing, especially for when you're under the influence, or I don't know. It just seems like there's also a lot of songs about drugs, like, and there's songs made for when you're on drugs. So what exactly is it about music? Is it the rhythmic beat, the lyric?
Yeah, people are researching this, and there's a lot of interest, for sure, about what it is. Although, again, I'm not. I don't think there's necessarily there has to be a connection, but you do see all kinds of settings and examples of how music and the experience and not necessarily the collective experience of being in a large crowd. Even
Mm,
this connection with music and the experience might be just more individualized.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it. I'm sure there are all kinds of um, neurochemical activities that are taking place that are being enhanced and activated and energized
Hmm.
through through both mechanisms, the music and some kind of more drug-induced um, mechanism for people. So there's this sort of physiological harmony going on.
Hmm.
But then we also know the ways in which music can really have an effect on not just our consciousness, but our emotional state, but
Hmm.
our sense of um, where we are and where we came from. So orientation in some sense. So I think the connections there make sense.
Hmm.
But as we've seen in the class, is the number of songs that are dedicated
Hmm.
um, to tripping in some way are pretty amazing.
Hmm.
Much more prevalent now than 30 or 40 years ago, but still, we definitely have stuff from the 60s that attest to this interest and connection as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I find that interesting that the act of, you know, we're social creatures, but the act of coming together in, let's say, like a Bonnaroo or Burning Man, I think that's super cool. Just the idea of everyone coming together and just like unlocking your mind and just listening to music, having fun, socializing. Um,
Yeah.
have you ever been to Burning Man?
Oh, I've been to some. No, I haven't been to Burning Man. No, I've been to some festivals though, for sure. And I know the vibe,
Yeah, yeah.
possibilities, and the downers too. So, but as you say, it's a different kind of social network to be in,
Hmm.
and something we all miss terribly
Yeah.
with the way the world is, and
Hmm.
wonder if we'll be able to get back to that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But yeah, this is part of the draw for people is the music, the sense of being free and sort of disconnected from your familiar or traditional surroundings, and there too, it's not just your mind that's free, but really your body and
Hmm.
sort of who you are, where you place yourself, and what you do with your body is in a sort of different order when you're in a festival setting than when
Hmm.
you're you know, doing the normal
No, for
routine.
sure. So I wanted to ask, what are some myths you've noticed in either drugs in religion in particular or death in religion? What are some preconceived notions or myths that people have that aren't exactly the way it seems?
Um, some we talked about in class on the sacred drugs class had to do with addiction and the ways in which I don't know if I'd use the word myth, but more as like propaganda. That certain um, uh, certain kinds of stories can get blown up into forms of propaganda that can shape people's attitudes
Hmm.
about the dangers of drugs or some of the sort of pitfalls that might appear when someone is using drugs, and all kinds of ways in which drugs are seen and presented as being a mortal threat in some sense.
Hmm.
And so the literature, of course, is now really running a counter narrative there and trying to show in terms of um, science and scientific studies that in fact it's a smaller percentage of people who are getting addicted, and that the kinds of drugs that people get addicted to are in fact quite varied, and there are all kinds of different specific um, uh, sets of realities that are tied to how people consume heroin as opposed to psilocybin or something.
Hmm.
So that that's one. Both of these topics, I think there's uh, um, all kinds of preconceived notions around death, around drugs, and around what we were talking about earlier, sort of health.
Hmm.
I like to try to get students to to question, as cliche as that is, those assumptions and ways of thinking about the world. Even if the questioning leads right back to where the students started, I hope my classes are kind of more of a journey in some sense, where
Yeah, for sure.
you sort of allow your mind to get blown, or to really be opened up in ways, or to be allowed to think about topics in ways and in a space that really is enriching, or something, or
I
one
personally,
of the two things. Yeah.
I know, for sure. I personally saw it like as having all these distinctive ideas, and after taking some of your class and readings, it's kind of started to kind of interconnect these ideas that I thought were so distinct, and I thought that was super cool.
Well, yeah, and that I mean, I know that experience. I mean, when
Hmm.
you're as an undergraduate,
Hmm.
when there's a point in your education, at least I mean, this happened with me too, where it's just like all of a sudden, everything seems to be connecting in terms of
Hmm.
classes, and that's a great experience to have. That's a real, and it's interesting that it's so common.
Hmm.
It's
It
really
seems like, as you get older, it seems like a lot of the things in life aren't actually black and white, but mostly, as cliche it is, gray. But there's because it's a lot of opinions, a lot of ideas, but not a lot of distinctive facts. Um,
well, and yeah, certain things that are especially charged, and people have a great deal of um, investment, yeah, and
mhm.
kind of prioritizing certain views around religion, or death, or drugs, or sex, all that stuff.
Do you think weed is a gateway drug?
No.
No, you don't think so. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I don't think there are studies that show that that necessarily lead to other drug use.
Hmm.
Gateway is an interesting concept too. Of thinking about um, how we chart drug use and think
Hmm.
about the spread
Hmm.
and overconsumption. So that might be worth exploring more, thinking about gateways and how they're understood.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I personally don't think it's a gateway drug, but I mean, as we can, especially in high school, um, several years ago, it seemed like a lot of people would think that. It seemed like it was charged as such. The idea around society was it is a gateway drug. We shouldn't legalize marijuana, and stuff like that, right? That's kind of one of the cases that they had. A lot of people were like, "Oh, let's not legalize it. It's a gateway," um, and I just don't see it as such being a gateway drug because one, it's not an addictive substance, and I mean, like you said, not enough
Yeah.
research.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, and I think that language is certainly tied to the war on drugs, and they're again trying to shape public views,
Mhm.
you um, with other kinds of interests that are motivating um, how those views are being shaped and why. So much of that is tied into, as we talked about in class as well, history of racism and thinking about um, certain communities. So it's hard to clear out all the BS and get to, as you say, some of the facts and realities that are there. But it's a lost cause. I mean, legalization, decriminalization, we're here. It's happening, and
Mhm.
it'll eventually um, be in all of the states.
Mhm. So that's really interesting though. Like as like liquor and alcohol seems to be forever like acceptable, except for the short period in the United States. Um, and then there was huge backlash for it as opposed to LSD. Although there was backlash in marijuana, it just doesn't seem as radical as alcohol, and I don't understand why exactly that of all the substances that seems to have the strongest presence in a lot of different societies and culture, religions.
Alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it. It speaks to the sort of the widespread and long-standing historical reliance, on alcohol as a staple
Hmm.
in human societies.
Hmm.
And so we've seen the ways in which it's also brought into and incorporated into different religious traditions, whether we're talking about the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament and so on. So um, yeah, it's a much more acceptable and um, sort of domestic drug that
Hmm.
we don't think of it, as we don't think of it as a drug.
Yeah.
And so that too is, as you know, part of what I'm interested in is um, trying to um, confuse all of these categories and by using the word drug and
Mhm.
getting people to rethink how we classify things. Um, but then also for my book and what I'm hoping to really research and work on is thinking about drugs across the spectrum of psychedelics all the way to alcohol and coffee and um, prescription drugs, as we've talked about too. So I know we've been talking a lot about psychedelics, but the interesting connections with religion and tobacco are really also to
It's a
me
big one too.
just as fascinating.
Hmm.
Yeah,
No, for sure. Yeah,
yeah,
that's really interesting, especially to see that they say like the human brain isn't fully developed till up to 25, give or take. But yet the legal age is 21 for drinking, and the ability to sign up for the army is 18. So
yeah.
that's
Well,
some very interesting cultural like markers or like
well,
bonds that we put.
yeah.
Hmm.
When are you an adult?
Yeah,
And that you can find how people make that transition
exactly.
in all different human cultures.
Hmm.
America, it's not as clear cut
Hmm.
in many ways. There aren't the rituals, as people have written about, that really can serve to, I'm not going to use the word mark again, identify a moment of transition when you are, an adult. And so, yeah, that we have all these mixed messages about when you can drink or when you can vote or when you can drive. And yeah, it's a really very powerful time of transition and transformation in
Hmm.
in our lives. It was a long time ago for me. I got other transitions to consider.
Uh-huh. So I appreciate you being here and taking the time to have this
Oh
talk
man.
with me. Do you have a? You said you have a new book coming out, right? Is it? Uh,
Well, I got the one you mentioned, the
that?
Don't Think About Death. Yeah, that's out,
Mm.
just out. So that's enough. But I'm hoping, yeah, the book on religion and drugs is in process, and I'm hoping to get that really together next summer.
Okay, cool, cool. I appreciate it. And people can reach you on your website or other social medias, I assume.
Oh, everywhere. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm easy to find now. So,
Well, I appreciate it, Harry. Thank you for.
yeah, sure, man. This is fun, and good luck with it all.
What is up, guys? So it looks like you made it to the end of the episode. I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and this was episode 3. Peace.